Malcolm Reed's hands were shaking as he carried his son through the automatic doors, but not from fear. He knew exactly what was wrong with Noah. He'd seen these symptoms 100 times before, back when he wore scrubs instead of grease-stained coveralls. Bacterial meningitis. Maybe 2 hours before irreversible damage. Maybe less. The woman in the expensive suit blocking his path to the triage desk didn't know that. She saw a poor black mechanic who didn't belong in her pristine hospital. She saw someone who could wait. She had no idea she was looking at one of the finest trauma surgeons Atlanta had ever trained. And Malcolm wasn't about to tell her. Not yet. If you want to see how a father's love challenged an entire system, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital blazed with the kind of sterile brightness that made everything look both too clean and somehow wrong. Malcolm Reed pushed through the emergency entrance with his 6-year-old son pressed against his chest, Noah's small body radiating heat that Malcolm could feel through both their shirts. The boy's head lolled against his father's shoulder, and every few seconds a whimper escaped his lips. "I got you, buddy," Malcolm whispered, his voice steady despite the hurricane of panic tearing through his chest. "Daddy's got you." The waiting room was a study in controlled chaos. A teenager clutched his basketball-injured ankle in one corner. An elderly woman coughed wetly into a tissue. A young mother bounced a crying infant while 2 other children tugged at her jacket. The air smelled like disinfectant, trying and failing to mask human suffering. Malcolm's eyes went immediately to the triage desk, calculating distance and time like he used to calculate blood loss and golden hours. 23 steps. 30 seconds if he moved fast. He started forward. "Excuse me, sir! Excuse me!" The voice cut through the ambient noise with the sharp precision of someone used to being obeyed. Malcolm stopped, turned his head, and found himself face to face with a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate catalog. Caroline Whitmore, according to the brass nameplate pinned to her tailored navy blazer. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her makeup was flawless. Her expression was not. "The line starts back there." She gestured toward a rope barrier where at least 15 people stood waiting. Malcolm looked at the line, then back at Noah, whose neck had gone rigid against his shoulder. Another symptom. Nuchal rigidity. The textbook was writing itself in real time on his son's body. "Ma'am, my son needs to be seen immediately." "I understand you're concerned." Caroline's tone managed to sound both sympathetic and dismissive at once. "But everyone here has someone who needs to be seen. We have a system." Malcolm felt the weight of Noah in his arms, felt the fever burning through the boy's Batman pajamas, felt every second ticking away like a countdown he couldn't stop. He also felt something else, the familiar press of judgment that came with the uniform he wore. The coveralls with Reed's Auto Repair stitched across the back. The grease under his fingernails that never quite came clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. The exhaustion in his face from pulling a double shift before his neighbor banged on his door at 11 p.m. to tell him Noah was sick. Caroline's eyes had already cataloged all of it. He could see the assumptions forming behind her professional mask. "Ma'am?" Malcolm kept his voice level, controlled, though his heart was hammering. "My son has a fever over 104. His neck is stiff, he's sensitive to light, and he's getting worse by the minute. He needs a doctor now." "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and take your place in line. Getting aggressive won't—" "I'm not being aggressive." The words came out harder than he intended. "I'm being specific. Those are symptoms of—" "I don't need a diagnosis from you, mister." She glanced at his coveralls again, reading his name from the patch. "Mr. Reed, I need you to wait your turn like everyone else." A security guard had materialized at the edge of Malcolm's peripheral vision. Of course. The pattern was so predictable it was almost funny. Almost. Malcolm looked at Caroline Whitmore, really looked at her, and saw something he recognized from a lifetime ago. The armor that came with authority, the absolute certainty that the world worked a certain way, and that she was on the right side of that order. He'd worn that armor himself once, when he'd walked these same halls in different clothes with different assumptions about what he deserved. "Please," he said quietly, and he hated how the word tasted. "My son is dying." Caroline's expression flickered. For just a second, Malcolm thought he saw something human underneath the corporate polish, but then her jaw tightened. Everyone in this room thinks their emergency is the worst one. That's why we have triage protocols. Now either take your place in line or I'll have to ask you to leave. Noah chose that moment to make a small, pained sound against Malcolm's neck. The boy's fingers clutched weakly at his father's collar. "Daddy, my head hurts so bad." "I know, baby, I know." Malcolm turned away from Caroline Whitmore and walked toward the line. Every instinct he'd spent years training screamed at him to fight, to shout, to demand what he knew Noah needed. But he'd learned the hard way that fighting only made things worse for men who looked like him. The system was designed to grind down resistance, to punish people who refused to know their place. So he waited. The man in front of him smelled like cigarettes and motor oil. The woman behind him was on her phone, loudly complaining about the wait. Malcolm focused on Noah, on keeping the boy comfortable, on monitoring every symptom even though he couldn't do anything about them yet. Noah's breathing had changed. Faster, shallower. Malcolm shifted his grip, supporting the boy's head more carefully. "How long have you been waiting?" Malcolm asked the man in front of him. "Hour and a half. Cut my hand pretty bad." The man held up a blood-soaked towel wrapped around his palm. "But they keep saying other people are worse." An hour and a half. Malcolm did the math. Noah had maybe 2 hours total before the infection could cause permanent damage. Probably less. He'd gotten him to the hospital in 30 minutes. Another 30 or 40 minutes. Waiting in line. Then however long it took for triage. Then the actual wait to see a doctor. The numbers didn't work. "Daddy?" Noah's voice was weak, confused. "Why are the lights so bright?" Photophobia. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and scanned the waiting room again. He knew what he should do. He knew what any good doctor would do. But he wasn't a doctor anymore. He was a mechanic holding his dying son in a hospital that saw him as just another poor black man taking up space. 15 minutes crawled by. The line moved forward exactly 3 people. Noah's fever was getting worse. Malcolm could feel it escalating, feel the heat building to dangerous levels. He shifted the boy in his arms again, trying to find a position that didn't press on his clearly aching neck. "Sir, you need to keep him still." A nurse passing by with a clipboard shot him an annoyed look. "You're making him more uncomfortable." "He's uncomfortable because he's sick," Malcolm said flatly. "Well, you'll be seen when it's your turn." She walked away. Malcolm watched her go, watched her stop to chat with another nurse at the desk, watched them both laugh at something on a computer screen while his son burned up in his arms. The rage that lived permanently in his chest, the rage that had moved in the day his wife died in a hospital, not so different from this one, flared hot and bright. He breathed through it, counted to 10, focused on Noah. "Tell me about your dream," he said softly, "the one about the spaceship." Noah tried to respond, but the words came out slurred, disconnected. Another symptom, altered mental state. Malcolm felt his own pulse accelerate. "It's okay, buddy. You can tell me later." "Malcolm?" A woman's voice, familiar but unexpected. He turned and found himself looking at Denise Mitchell, one of his neighbors from the apartment complex. She worked in hospital administration somewhere, he thought, though he'd never been clear on exactly what she did. "Denise, hey. What are you—" Her eyes dropped to Noah and widened. "Oh my God, is he okay?" "He's sick. We're waiting to be seen." Denise looked at the line, then at Noah, then back at Malcolm. Something shifted in her expression. "How long have you been waiting?" "About 20 minutes. "Wait here." She was already moving toward the triage desk, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. Malcolm watched her approach Caroline Whitmore, watched the 2 women talk in low, urgent voices. Caroline's eyes flicked toward Malcolm, then away. She shook her head. Denise's voice rose slightly. Caroline's expression hardened. Denise came back, her face tight with frustration. "I'm sorry. She's not budging. Says you were rude to her and that she can't set a precedent for people who make a scene." "I didn't make a scene. I asked her to help my son." "I know. I believe you. But she's—" Denise trailed off, looked at Caroline again, then back at Malcolm. "She's got a lot of power here, and not a lot of empathy. I'm sorry." "It's not your fault." Denise touched his arm briefly. "I have to get back to work. But if you need anything—" "I need a doctor," Malcolm said simply. "But apparently that's too much to ask." Another 10 minutes. The line moved forward 2 more people. Noah had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than the whimpering. Malcolm talked to him anyway, kept up a steady stream of nonsense about baseball and cartoons and what they'd do when he felt better, all while cataloging every symptom, every change, every sign that time was running out. The woman in front of him finally reached the triage desk. Malcolm was next. He could see the nurse there, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Patricia. Almost there. Just hold on, Noah. Almost there. Then Noah's body went rigid in his arms. The seizure started before Malcolm could process what was happening. 1 second his son was lying limply against his chest. The next, every muscle had locked up tight. Noah's eyes rolled back, his jaw clenched. His small body began to shake with violent, rhythmic jerks. Noah! Malcolm dropped to his knees, cradling his son's head, turning him on his side. His hands moved on autopilot, doing what they'd been trained to do years ago. Somebody help! He's seizing! The waiting room erupted into chaos around him. People jumped up, backed away, stared. Someone screamed. Malcolm ignored all of it. His entire world had collapsed to the small boy convulsing in his arms, and the clinical protocols running through his head like muscle memory. I need diazepam, he shouted. 5 milligrams IV or 10 rectal, and get me an airway kit, now. He wasn't thinking about who he was or who he was supposed to be. He was thinking about saving his son. Move back! Everyone move back! A doctor, finally a doctor, pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees next to Malcolm. He was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and competent hands. Sir, I need you to step aside and let me— He needs diazepam, 5 milligrams, Malcolm said, not moving. He's 6 years old, about 45 pounds. Seizure started approximately 30 seconds ago. Prior symptoms include fever over 104, nuchal rigidity, photophobia, and altered mental state. This is likely bacterial meningitis. You need to start broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately, but first stabilize the seizure. The doctor stared at him. Sir, how do you— Just do it! Malcolm's voice cracked. Please! The young doctor's training kicked in. He started barking orders. Nurses materialized with equipment. Someone pressed an oxygen mask toward Noah's face. Malcolm held his son steady while they worked, while they pushed the medication, while they counted seconds that felt like hours. 90 seconds, 2 minutes. Finally, the seizure began to break. Noah's rigid muscles started to relax. His breathing evened out, though he remained unconscious. We need to get him to Trauma Bay 2, the doctor said. Someone get me a gurney and call neuro. Tell them we've got a possible meningitis case. I'm coming with him, Malcolm said. Sir, you need to let us— I'm coming with him. Malcolm's tone left no room for argument. He'd been polite, he'd waited in line. He'd played by the rules. His son had paid the price. He was done being invisible. The doctor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but you stay back and let us work. They lifted Noah onto a gurney. Malcolm walked beside it, his hand on his son's small shoulder, as they rushed down the hallway. The waiting room blurred past. Caroline Whitmore's shocked face appeared and disappeared at the edge of his vision. He didn't care. She didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the boy on the gurney. Trauma Bay 2 was exactly as Malcolm remembered from his old life. All stainless steel and organized chaos, monitors beeping, bright lights, a team of people moving with choreographed precision. They transferred Noah to the bed, started multiple IVs, drew blood. Someone called out vitals while someone else prepped a lumbar puncture kit. Malcolm stood against the wall where he'd been told to stand, his hands clenched into fists, his body vibrating with the need to do something, anything. The young doctor appeared at his elbow. Sir, I need you to answer some questions. When did the symptoms start? Malcolm forced himself to focus. High fever started around 8 p.m. I thought it was just a cold at first. Then the neck stiffness started around 10. Photophobia shortly after. I brought him straight here. Any recent illnesses? Vaccinations up to date? He had a cold 2 weeks ago. Vaccinations are current. Malcolm rattled off the information mechanically, part of his brain still tracking every movement the medical team made around Noah's bed. And you said you think it's bacterial meningitis. What made you— I know what bacterial meningitis looks like, Malcolm interrupted. I've seen it before. The doctor studied him more carefully. Are you in medicine? The question hung in the air between them. Malcolm looked at his grease-stained hands, at the coveralls he still wore, at the man he'd become versus the man he used to be. Used to be, he said finally. Used to be what? A trauma surgeon. The doctor's eyebrows shot up. You're a surgeon? Was. I don't practice anymore. Why not? Long story. Malcolm turned back to watch the team working on Noah. They were good, efficient, but he could see places where they were hesitating, second-guessing. The LP needs to happen faster. Every minute counts with bacterial meningitis. The doctor looked at the team, then at Malcolm. You want to scrub in? I'm not licensed anymore. I didn't ask if you were licensed. I asked if you want to help save your son. Malcolm's throat tightened. For 6 years, he'd kept medicine locked in a box inside his chest, buried it under grief and guilt and the daily grind of survival. Opening that box meant facing everything he'd run away from. It meant remembering who he used to be, what he used to love, and why he'd abandoned it all. But Noah was lying on that table, unconscious and burning with fever, and Malcolm would face any amount of pain if it meant bringing him back. Yes, he said. I want to help. Bukuk, the doctor, Malcolm caught his name tag finally, Dr. Chen, pointed to the scrub sink. Then wash up, quickly. Malcolm's hands remembered what to do before his brain caught up. The precise angle to hold them under the water, the methodical progression from fingertips to forearms, the meditative rhythm that used to center him before walking into an operating room. As the water ran brown with grease and oil, he felt something else washing away too. The pretense that he could keep running, the lie that he could stay hidden forever. He dried off, pulled on a gown and gloves, and stepped up to Noah's bedside. Okay, Dr. Chen said, talk me through it. And just like that, Malcolm was a doctor again. Patient is a 6-year-old male, approximately 45 pounds, presenting with high fever, nuptial rigidity, photophobia, altered mental state, and tonic-clonic seizure. Strong likelihood of bacterial meningitis. Primary concern is identifying the pathogen and starting targeted antibiotics. But first we need to rule out elevated intracranial pressure before proceeding with lumbar puncture. Malcolm's voice had changed. Gone was the hesitant, deferential tone he'd used with Caroline Whitmore. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who had earned the right to be heard. The other doctors and nurses in the room were staring at him now. Malcolm ignored them. Did you do a CT? He asked. Ordered, one of the nurses said, but it'll take at least 20 minutes to get him down there and back. 20 minutes Noah didn't have. Malcolm looked at the monitors, at his son's pupils, at the subtle signs that his trained eyes could read like a book. No signs of herniation. Pupils are equal and reactive. No papilledema that I can see. We can't wait for the CT. We need that CSF now. Dr. Chen hesitated only a second, then nodded. Get me an LP kit. Doctor, Reed, you want to do the honors? It had been 6 years since Malcolm had done a lumbar puncture. 6 years since he'd held a medical instrument for anything other than watching tutorial videos late at night when he couldn't sleep, torturing himself with memories of what he used to be. His hands didn't shake as he positioned Noah on his side, curled into a fetal position. Didn't shake as he palpated the spaces between vertebrae, finding the right spot by touch and memory. Didn't shake as he inserted the needle with the smooth, confident motion of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Clear fluid began to drip into the collection tube. Cloudy. Not good. Turbid CSF, Malcolm said. Definitely bacterial. Start empiric antibiotics immediately. Ceftriaxone and vancomycin, and dexamethasone to reduce inflammation. Doses? Dr. Chen asked, though Malcolm could tell he was testing him now. Ceftriaxone. 50 milligrams per kilogram every 12 hours. Vancomycin 15 milligrams per kilogram every 6 hours. Dexamethasone 0.15 milligrams per kilogram every 6 hours. Start them all now. Don't wait for the culture results. Orders were shouted. Medications appeared. Malcolm stepped back from the table as the team took over, as they pushed the antibiotics through Noah's IV, as they stabilized his airway and adjusted his positioning and did all the things that might save his life. Might. The word echoed in Malcolm's head. 6 years ago, he would have said will. 6 years ago, he'd believed that good medicine and skilled hands could fix anything. Then he'd stood in a different trauma bay and watched his wife bleed out despite everything he knew, everything he tried, every desperate prayer he'd never believed in until the moment he lost her. Dr. Reed. Dr. Chen appeared beside him again. Nice work. Malcolm, just Malcolm. Well, just Malcolm, that was some of the cleanest clinical thinking I've seen in a while. Where did you train? Emory. Did my residency there, practiced at Grady for 5 years. Grady? Dr. Chen's respect level visibly increased. Grady Memorial was where the best trauma surgeons in Atlanta cut their teeth. Why'd you leave? Malcolm looked at Noah, at the rise and fall of his small chest, at the monitors tracking every heartbeat. Personal reasons. Doctor. Chen was smart enough not to push. Well, your son is lucky to have you. That seizure could have done serious damage if you hadn't known what to do. He wouldn't have had a seizure if someone had listened to me in the first place. The words came out harder than Malcolm intended. Dr. Chen followed his gaze toward the waiting room, toward where Caroline Whitmore had been standing. The board director. I heard about that. Dr. Chen's voice was careful. She's not always great with people who don't fit her idea of what a patient should look like. You mean poor people? Black people? I mean, people she thinks are beneath her. Dr. Chen met his eyes. Which, yeah, tends to overlap with poor people and black people. I've seen her pull this before. It's bullshit, and I'm sorry. Malcolm appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't change anything. How long before we know if the antibiotics are working? Couple hours before we see clinical improvement, assuming we caught it in time, which, thanks to you, I think we did. Dr. Chen glanced at the monitors. He's stable now. We'll move him to pediatric ICU for monitoring, but his vitals are trending in the right direction. Malcolm nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The adrenaline that had carried him through the last hour was starting to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control. There's a family consultation room down the hall, Dr. Chen said gently. You should sit down. Maybe get some coffee. We'll take care of him. I'm staying here. Malcolm? I'm staying. Malcolm's voice was quiet, but absolute. I've left too many people in hospitals I couldn't protect. I'm not leaving my son. Doctor. Chen looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Malcolm's face must have told him it was pointless. He nodded. Okay. I'll have someone bring you a chair. As the medical team worked around him and Noah's condition slowly began to stabilize, Malcolm stood against the wall and felt the fault lines in his carefully constructed life beginning to crack. For 6 years, he told himself that walking away from medicine was the only way to survive losing his wife. That becoming someone else, someone simpler, someone who didn't carry the weight of life and death in his hands, was the only way to keep breathing. But standing in this trauma bay, using skills he'd thought he'd buried forever, feeling the old rhythms of medical decision-making flow through him like muscle memory, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like coming back to life. And that terrified him more than anything. Because if he let himself be a doctor again, even for one night, he'd have to face the fact that he'd been running. That he'd let fear and grief turn him into a shadow of who he used to be. That he'd been hiding behind grease and coveralls and the comfortable anonymity of being invisible. Noah stirred on the bed, his eyelids fluttering. Malcolm moved to his side immediately, taking his son's small hand in his own. Daddy? The word was barely a whisper. Right here, buddy. I'm right here. My head still hurts. I know. But the medicine is going to make it better. You just have to rest. Noah's eyes focused on him with effort. You were talking like a doctor. Malcolm felt his throat close up. Yeah, I was. I didn't know you could do that. There's a lot you don't know about me, buddy. Malcolm stroked his son's hair gently. But we can talk about it later. Right now you need to sleep. Don't leave, Noah whispered. Never. I'm staying right here until you're better. Noah's eyes closed again, his breathing evening out into something that looked almost peaceful. Malcolm kept holding his hand, kept vigil, kept watch the way he'd failed to do 6 years ago when Alicia had been bleeding out and he'd been so focused on the medical crisis that he'd forgotten to just hold her hand and tell her he loved her. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Malcolm? A woman's voice from the doorway. Not Denise this time. Malcolm turned and found himself looking at Caroline Whitmore. She looked different than she had in the waiting room. The corporate armor had cracked, her makeup was smudged, her perfect hair had come loose from its chignon, and her eyes looked haunted. "I need to—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I need to apologize." Malcolm didn't respond, just looked at her, waiting. "I was wrong," Caroline continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with your son's medical needs. And because of that, he almost—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He almost died," Malcolm finished for her. "Because you decided I didn't matter. Because you looked at my clothes and my skin and decided I was someone who could wait." "Yes." The word came out like a confession. "And I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry. Deeply, truly sorry." Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, then back at Noah. "My son could have brain damage right now, permanent disability. He could be dead, all because you couldn't see past your own prejudices for 5 minutes. I know. Do you?" Malcolm's voice was soft but sharp. "Do you really? Or are you just sorry because it turned out I knew what I was talking about? Would you be apologizing if I'd just been a scared mechanic who got lucky?" Caroline flinched like he'd struck her. "You don't know," Malcolm said. "And that's the problem. You think this is about me specifically, about one bad judgment call. But it's not. It's about every person who walks through those doors looking tired or poor or wrong somehow and gets treated like they're wasting your time. How many of them die, Ms. Whitmore? How many of them suffer because people like you can't be bothered to look past the surface? I don't have an answer for that. Then maybe you should find one." Caroline stood in the doorway for another moment, then nodded slowly and walked away. Malcolm watched her go, felt no satisfaction in her pain, just a tired, empty kind of sadness that came from fighting battles he shouldn't have had to fight. The night wore on. Noah's fever started to break around 3 a.m. By 5 a.m., he was sleeping peacefully, his vitals stable, the antibiotics doing their work. Dr. Chen came by to check on them, gave Malcolm a tired smile, and confirmed what Malcolm already knew from the monitors. His son was going to be okay. "You should get some rest," Dr. Chen said. We'll watch him." "I'm good here." "Malcolm, you've been standing for 8 hours straight. At least sit down." Malcolm finally lowered himself into the chair someone had brought, his body aching with exhaustion. But he didn't let go of Noah's hand. As dawn began to lighten the windows and the hospital shifted into its morning rhythm, Malcolm Reed sat beside his son and felt the weight of what had happened settle onto his shoulders. He'd saved Noah's life tonight, but he'd also pulled back a curtain he'd spent 6 years keeping closed, and there was no putting it back now. The question was what he would do about it, because the skills that had saved his son tonight could save other people's children too. The knowledge he'd spent 6 years pretending he didn't have could matter, could make a difference. But using it meant stepping back into a world that had taken everything from him once before. It meant risking that kind of pain again. Malcolm looked at Noah's sleeping face, at the peaceful rise and fall of his chest, at the life he'd fought so hard to protect. And he thought about all the other parents in all the other waiting rooms, hoping someone would listen, praying someone would care enough to look past assumptions and see the emergency right in front of them. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 6 years, he was asking the question. And maybe that was enough for now. The morning sun cut through the hospital blinds in sharp geometric patterns, painting stripes across Noah's sleeping face. Malcolm watched the light move as the earth turned, as time passed in the measured beeps of monitors and the distant sounds of shift change. He'd been awake for 26 hours straight, but sleep felt like something that happened to other people, in other lives. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, looking only marginally more rested than Malcolm felt. He offered one to Malcolm, who took it with a nod of thanks. "His labs came back," Dr. Chen said quietly, pulling up a chair. "CSF culture confirms Streptococcus pneumoniae, sensitive to the antibiotics we started, which is good news. We caught it early enough that I don't anticipate any permanent neurological damage." Malcolm's hand tightened around the coffee cup. "You don't anticipate, but you can't guarantee." "No, I can't guarantee." Dr. Chen's honesty was both brutal and appreciated. But his neuro exam this morning was completely normal. He's responding appropriately, his reflexes are good, no signs of any deficits. If we're going to see complications, they usually show up in the first 72 hours. So far, he's doing everything right. So far. Malcolm, you know how this works. You know we can't promise outcomes, only probabilities. And the probabilities here are strongly in Noah's favor. Malcolm did know. That was the curse of medical knowledge, understanding exactly how many things could still go wrong, how many ways the human body could betray the best intentions of science. But it was also why he'd been able to save his son's life last night. The knowledge cut both ways. When can he go home? Minimum 72 hours of IV antibiotics, probably closer to 5 days. Then we'll transition him to oral, and he can finish the course at home. Dr. Chen studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. You should go home, get some sleep, shower. We'll call you if anything changes. I'm not leaving. Your employer might have something to say about that. Malcolm almost laughed. I own the shop. I can take the time off. You own an auto repair shop. Dr. Chen said it carefully, like he was fitting puzzle pieces together. And you used to be a trauma surgeon at Grady. That's quite a career change. Life happens. Life happens, Dr. Chen repeated. That's one way to put it. He leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee. Can I ask you something? And you can tell me to mind my own business if you want. Malcolm waited. Why'd you really leave medicine? The question sat between them like a physical thing. Malcolm could deflect it, change the subject, hide behind the walls he'd built. But something about the long night and the too bright morning and the steady beep of his son's heartbeat made him too tired to keep lying. My wife died in childbirth 6 years ago, he said. Right downstairs in this hospital, labor and delivery, room 302. She was healthy, pregnancy was perfect, and then suddenly she wasn't, and it wasn't, and I couldn't. He stopped, swallowed. I couldn't save her. Dr. Chen didn't offer platitudes, just nodded slowly, taking it in. Placental abruption, Malcolm continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. Massive hemorrhage. We did everything, transfusions, emergency, C-section, tried to control the bleeding, but it was too fast, too catastrophic. She died 20 minutes after Noah was born. Died while I was still in my scrubs, still covered in her blood, holding our son and trying to figure out how to keep breathing. I'm sorry. Everyone was sorry. The attending was sorry. The nurses were sorry. The hospital administration sent a sorry card with a sorry fruit basket. Malcolm's voice had gone flat. But sorry doesn't change the fact that I stood there with all my training, all my expertise, and watched her die anyway. Doesn't change the fact that I knew too much, knew exactly what was happening, knew exactly how bad it was, knew the precise moment when we lost her. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. So you walked away. So I walked away, Malcolm agreed. Let my license lapse, cashed out my retirement, bought a failing auto shop in a neighborhood that needed one. Became someone else. Someone who fixed engines instead of bodies. Someone who couldn't fail at saving lives because he wasn't responsible for them anymore. But you're still a doctor. Last night proved that. Last night proved I remember how to be a doctor. That's not the same thing. Malcolm looked at Noah, at the IV in his small arm, at the monitors tracking every vital sign. I can't go back to that world, Chen. Can't wake up every day knowing that despite everything I know, everything I can do, I might still lose someone. Might still have to stand there helpless while somebody's wife or son or mother dies right in front of me. So you'd rather fix cars. So I'd rather fix cars, Malcolm said. Cars don't bleed. Cars don't have families who trust you to save them. Cars are just problems with solutions. You diagnose the issue, you fix it, and it either works or it doesn't. Nobody grieves for a busted transmission. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. I get it. I do. But Malcolm, you saved your son's life last night, not just because you got him here, but because you knew what to do when everyone else was fumbling, because you could read the signs and make the calls and execute the procedures. You think a mechanic could have done that? A mechanic wouldn't have needed to. If Caroline Whitmore had done her job and gotten him to triage immediately, but she didn't, Dr. Chen interrupted. She didn't. And your son seized in the waiting room, and you were the only person there who could handle it. That's not an accident, Malcolm. That's 6 years of training and 5 years of practice that live in your muscle memory. That's who you are, whether you're wearing coveralls or scrubs. Malcolm didn't have an answer for that. Didn't want to acknowledge the truth of it, the way his hands had remembered everything last night, the way his brain had shifted into clinical mode without conscious thought, the way it had felt almost like relief to be solving medical problems again instead of running from them. Noah stirred in the bed, his eyes blinking open slowly. "Dad?" Malcolm was on his feet immediately, setting down the coffee, taking his son's hand. "Hey, buddy, how you feeling?" "Tired, and my arm hurts." Well, Noah looked at the IV with confusion. "Why do I have a tube?" "It's medicine to make you better. The doctors had to give it to you through your arm because you were too sick to swallow pills." "Am I still sick?" "You're getting better, but you have to stay here for a few days so they can make sure the medicine works." Noah processed this with the solemn consideration of a 6-year-old trying to be brave. "Will you stay with me?" "Every minute." "Promise?" "Promise." Malcolm squeezed his hand gently. "You hungry?" "A little." "That's a good sign," Dr. Chen said, standing up. "I'll have the nurses bring something light, maybe some broth and crackers. We'll see how that goes before we try anything heavier." As Dr. Chen left, Noah looked up at Malcolm with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in hours. "Dad, why were you talking about doctor stuff last night? I heard you, but it was all fuzzy." Malcolm sat on the edge of the bed carefully, mindful of the IV lines. "I used to be a doctor, Noah, before you were born." "Like a real doctor?" "Like a real doctor. I worked in hospitals and helped people who were hurt or sick." "Why'd you stop?" "How did you explain grief to a 6-year-old? How did you tell your son that his birth and his mother's death were tangled up together in a knot so tight that even thinking about it made it hard to breathe?" "It's complicated," Malcolm said. "But the important thing is that I remembered how to help you when you needed it. That's all that matters right now." Noah accepted this with the easy trust of childhood. "Mrs. Patterson says you're the best mechanic in Atlanta." Mrs. Patterson was their neighbor, the one who watched Noah when Malcolm had to work late. "Mrs. Patterson is biased." "What's biased mean?" "It means she likes us, so she thinks we're better than we are." "But you're good at fixing cars, right?" "Yeah, buddy. I'm good at fixing cars. And you're good at being a doctor, too." Malcolm felt something crack in his chest. "I used to be." "You were good last night. I remember you sounded important. Like everyone had to listen to you." "Everyone should have listened to you being sick earlier. That's what I'm mad about." Noah's forehead wrinkled in thought. "The lady in the fancy clothes? She was mean to you." "She was scared," Malcolm said, though the generosity cost him. "Sometimes people get scared and they act mean because it makes them feel safer." "Why was she scared of you?" "Out of the mouths of babes." Malcolm took a breath. "She wasn't scared of me exactly. She was scared of things being different than what she expected. Of her hospital not working the way she thought it should. Of having to admit she was wrong. The truth was more complicated and uglier than that, threaded through with racism and classism and all the ways people protected their power by keeping others small. But Noah was 6 and sick and didn't need to carry that weight yet. There would be time enough for those lessons later. A nurse came in with a tray, broth, crackers, apple juice. Noah ate slowly, carefully, while Malcolm watched every swallow like he could will the food to stay down through sheer force of attention. The broth stayed down. The crackers stayed down. Small victories that felt monumental. "Mr. Reed?" Another nurse appeared in the doorway, young and nervous. "There's someone here to see you. She said it's important." Malcolm's first thought was Denise, but when he stepped into the hallway, he found Caroline Whitmore instead. She looked like she'd been up all night too. Same clothes as yesterday, makeup completely gone now, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that was nothing like the corporate perfection she'd worn before. "I know you don't want to see me," she said before he could speak, "and I won't take much of your time, but I need to show you something." Malcolm crossed his arms. "I'm listening." "Not here. It's..." She glanced at the nurse's station, at the doctors walking past. "It's sensitive. Can you come to my office for 15 minutes? Your son is stable, and I promise I'll have you back before... I'm not leaving Noah." "I understand, but Malcolm, this is important. This is about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Something in her voice made him pause. She wasn't asking as Caroline Whitmore, hospital board director with her armor intact. She was asking as someone who'd seen something that had shaken her badly enough to strip away all the protective layers. 15 minutes, he said. And if anything changes with Noah, they'll call you immediately. I've already arranged it. Malcolm checked on Noah one more time. The boy had fallen back asleep, his breathing easy and regular, then followed Caroline through the hospital corridors. She didn't make small talk, just walked with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. They took an elevator to the administrative floor, walked past offices that were just starting to fill with the morning shift, and finally entered a corner office with Caroline's name on the door. The office was exactly what Malcolm would have expected. Sleek furniture, carefully chosen art, a desk that probably cost more than his monthly rent. But the computer screen was what Caroline pointed to, and the careful corporate aesthetic didn't matter anymore. I've been up all night going through our emergency department records for the past year, she said, pulling up a spreadsheet. Looking at wait times, triage decisions, patient outcomes, and I found something that made me sick. Malcolm moved closer to the screen. The data was color-coded, green for patients seen quickly, yellow for moderate delays, red for dangerous delays. There was a lot of red. These are the patients who waited more than an hour to be triaged despite presenting with potentially life-threatening symptoms, Caroline said, scrolling through row after row. 47 cases in the past 12 months. That's almost one a week. Malcolm scanned the data, his medical training automatically categorizing the cases. Chest pain, severe abdominal pain, high fever with altered mental status. All symptoms that should have triggered immediate triage. Now watch what happens when I filter by demographic data, Caroline said quietly. She clicked something and the red rows rearranged themselves. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten. 72% of the dangerous delays involved patients of color, Caroline said. 81% involved patients without private insurance. 93% involved patients from zip codes below the median income level. She looked at him. This isn't random. This is a pattern. This is racism, Malcolm said bluntly. Structural, systematic racism baked into your triage protocols. Yes. Caroline didn't flinch from the word. That's exactly what it is. And I didn't see it. I've been on this board for 3 years, reviewed hundreds of reports, approved dozens of policy changes, and I never once looked at the data this way. Never thought to ask if we were treating everyone equally. Just assumed we were because we're supposed to be. Malcolm studied the spreadsheet, feeling anger and vindication and a tired kind of despair all mixed together. How many died? Caroline's hand trembled slightly on the mouse. 4. 4 people died in our waiting room or shortly after admission because their conditions deteriorated while they waited. All 4 were Black or Latino. All 4 had Medicaid or no insurance. All 4 came from neighborhoods we'd call underserved. You mean poor? I mean systematically divested from, intentionally neglected, and treated as less important than wealthy white neighborhoods. Yes. Caroline pulled up another screen. But it's worse than just triage delays. Look at this. The new data showed treatment outcomes, complication rates, readmission statistics. The disparities were stark and damning. Black patients in our ER are 37% more likely to have their pain undertreated than white patients with identical conditions, Caroline said. Latino patients wait an average of 42 minutes longer for the same level of care. Patients without insurance are discharged faster and with less comprehensive treatment plans. She pulled up case after case, painting a picture of a hospital that talked about equity and excellence while quietly, consistently failing the most vulnerable people who walked through its doors. Why are you showing me this? Malcolm asked. Caroline turned to face him fully. Because you were right. Last night, when you said this wasn't about one bad judgment call, that it was about a system that treats people like you as less important, you were right, and I need your help to fix it. My help. I'm bringing this to the board today. Full presentation, all the data, recommendations for immediate policy changes. But data isn't enough. I need someone who can speak to what this actually means, what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this bias. Someone who can make them understand that these aren't just numbers, they're people. They're fathers holding sick children who get told to wait. Their families watching loved ones suffer because someone decided they didn't matter enough. Malcolm shook his head. Get one of the patient advocates. Get someone from community outreach. I need you. You're a doctor, so they can't dismiss you as not understanding medical necessity. You're a patient, so you can speak to the experience directly. And frankly, Malcolm, you're someone who can walk into a room and command respect even when people want to ignore you. I saw that last night. What you saw last night was me fighting to save my son's life. Exactly. And there are dozens of other parents who might have to fight that same fight in the next year if we don't change things. You can help me make sure they don't have to. Malcolm looked at the data on the screen, at the rows of red that represented suffering, fear, preventable harm. He thought about all the people who'd sat in that waiting room like he had, hoping someone would listen, and all the people who'd kept waiting while their conditions got worse. "When's the board meeting?" he heard himself ask. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock. I need to be back with Noah by 3:30. I'll make sure of it." Malcolm was about to respond when his phone buzzed. The hospital number. His heart kicked into overdrive as he answered. "Mr. Reed, this is Patricia from the PICU. Noah's fine, but he's asking for you. He got a little upset when he woke up and you weren't here." Relief and guilt flooded through him in equal measure. "Tell him I'm on my way. 2 minutes." He hung up and looked at Caroline. "I have to go." "Of course. But you'll think about the board meeting?" Malcolm was already moving toward the door. "I'll think about it." He took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, his body remembering the layout of the hospital from years ago when he'd worked here. Different building, same basic structure, same fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell and underlying current of crisis barely held at bay. Noah was sitting up in bed when Malcolm arrived, tears on his face, but not actively crying. Patricia, the triage nurse from last night, sat beside him with a picture book. "Daddy!" Noah reached for him. Malcolm gathered him up carefully, mindful of the IV. "I'm sorry, buddy. I just had to talk to someone for a few minutes. I'm back now." "I thought you left." "Never. I promised I'd stay, remember?" Noah nodded against his chest, his small body gradually relaxing. Patricia caught Malcolm's eye and smiled sadly. "I heard about what happened last night," she said quietly, "in the waiting room. I'm sorry. If I'd been at triage instead of on break, I would have gotten him back immediately. It's not your fault." "Maybe not, but it's not right either." She stood up, smoothing her scrubs. "For what it's worth, I've been saying for years that our triage protocols need to change, that we're missing people who need help because we're making assumptions based on the wrong things. Did anyone listen? Not yet. But maybe now they will." She touched Noah's head gently. "You've got a brave kid here and a smart dad. That's a good combination." After Patricia left, Malcolm settled into the chair with Noah half in his lap, reading the picture book she'd left behind. It was about a bear who was scared of thunderstorms, and by the 3rd page, Noah was making the sound effects, his fear forgotten in the familiar rhythm of story time. Dr. Chen came by on rounds, checked Noah's vitals, adjusted his antibiotic dosing, and pronounced himself cautiously optimistic. A child life specialist brought toys and coloring books. The morning shifted into afternoon with the slow, elastic sense of time that came with hospital stays, everything both dragging and rushing at once. Around 1:30, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. "Caroline." "I don't mean to pressure you," her text read, "but I'm presenting in 30 minutes. If you're willing to speak, even just for 5 minutes, it would make a real difference." Malcolm looked at Noah, who was watching cartoons on the room's television with the serious concentration that kids brought to important matters like animated dogs solving mysteries. "Buddy, I might need to go to a meeting for a little while this afternoon, but Mrs. Patterson said she could come sit with you. Would that be okay?" Noah's face scrunched up. "You promised you'd stay." "I know. And I will stay, most of the time. But there's something important I might need to do. Something that could help make sure other kids don't get scared like you did last night." "What thing?" "Some people at the hospital did something wrong. They didn't help us fast enough because they were being unfair. And now I have a chance to tell other important people about it so they can fix it." Noah thought about this. "Like when Tommy pushed me at school and I told the teacher?" "Kind of like that, yeah. And then Tommy had to apologize and he couldn't play at recess." "Right, except this is bigger than recess. This is about making sure doctors listen to all the moms and dads who bring their kids here." Noah nodded slowly. "You should tell them, but come back fast, okay?" "Fast as I can. Malcolm texted Caroline that he'd be there, then called Mrs. Patterson, who arrived within 20 minutes with a bag full of Noah's favorite snacks and a promise to guard him with her life. Noah was settled with a juice box and a new coloring book when Malcolm kissed his forehead and headed for the administrative wing. The boardroom was exactly what he expected. Long polished table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 12 people in expensive suits sat around the table, most of them white, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Caroline stood at the head of the table next to a projector screen, her laptop open in front of her. She looked up when Malcolm entered, relief visible on her face. "Everyone, this is Malcolm Reed. He's going to speak to us today about his experience in our emergency department last night." The board members turned to look at him. Malcolm saw their eyes catalog his appearance. Still in the same grease-stained coveralls from yesterday. Unshaven, exhausted. He saw them dismiss him in the space of a heartbeat. Good. Let them underestimate him. He'd spent 6 years being underestimated. "Mr. Reed," the chairman said, checking his watch. "We appreciate you taking the time. Please, have a seat." "I'll stand, thanks." Malcolm moved to stand beside Caroline, facing the table. "I won't take much of your time. I know you're all busy, but I want to tell you about last night." He told them. About Noah's symptoms. About his attempt to explain the urgency to Caroline, about being told to wait. About the seizure on the waiting room floor. About nearly losing his son because someone had decided they didn't look like they mattered enough. "Now, I'm a mechanic," Malcolm said. "I own a shop on the east side. I wear coveralls and I smell like motor oil, and I drive a 15-year-old truck. None of that has anything to do with whether my son deserves immediate medical attention when he's dying of bacterial meningitis. But somehow, in your hospital, it did." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Reed, I'm sure this was an unfortunate miscommunication." "It wasn't a miscommunication. It was a judgment call based on bias. And according to the data Ms. Whitmore is about to show you, it's a judgment call that happens here almost once a week." Caroline pulled up her first slide. The board members leaned forward, squinting at numbers. 72% of dangerous triage delays involve patients of color," Malcolm continued, reading the data they were seeing. 4 preventable deaths in 12 months, all minorities, all poor or uninsured. That's not coincidence. That's policy failure driven by systemic racism. "Now wait just a minute," an older white man started. "I'm not finished." Malcolm's voice cut through the protest cleanly. "I also used to be a doctor, trauma surgeon, worked at Grady for 5 years before I left medicine. So I know what good triage looks like. I know the protocols. I know what should have happened last night. And I know that if I'd walked in wearing a suit instead of coveralls, if I'd been white instead of black, my son would have been in a trauma bay 30 minutes earlier." The room was silent now. Caroline advanced to the next slide. "Ms. Whitmore has put together comprehensive data showing exactly how systemic this problem is," Malcolm said. "But I'm not here to talk about statistics. I'm here to talk about my son, who almost died because your staff made assumptions about who deserves urgent care based on what we looked like. I'm here to talk about the 4 people who did die, who had families that loved them, who deserved better. I'm here to ask what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't keep happening." He let the question hang in the air. Caroline took over, walking them through slide after slide of damning data, proposed policy changes, mandatory bias training, revised triage protocols. Malcolm watched the board members' faces cycle through denial, defensiveness, and finally something that might have been shame. When Caroline finished, the chairman cleared his throat. "This is troubling, very troubling. We'll need to form a committee to review—" "No!" Well, Malcolm spoke before he consciously decided to. "No more committees, no more reviews. You implement changes now, today. Because next week another family is going to walk through those doors needing help, and they deserve to get it regardless of what they look like or where they're from. Mr. Reed, I understand your passion, but hospital policy changes require careful consideration. My son seized on your waiting room floor. How much more consideration do you need?" The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, a younger woman halfway down the table spoke up. "He's right. We can't keep studying this while people die. I move that we implement Ms. Whitmore's recommendations immediately, with a 90-day review to assess effectiveness." "I second," another board member said quickly. The vote was unanimous. Malcolm wasn't naive enough to think that meant the fight was over. Institutional change was slow and hard, and people protected their power fiercely. But it was a start. It was something. As the meeting broke up, Caroline caught his arm. "Thank you. I don't think they would have moved that fast without you." They moved because the data scared them, because they realized they're legally liable if this keeps happening. Maybe, but you made it real for them. Made them see the human cost. Malcolm checked his watch. He'd been gone 45 minutes. "I need to get back to Noah." "Of course, but Malcolm, there's one more thing." Caroline pulled an envelope from her briefcase. "The hospital wants to fund the reinstatement of your medical license. Full sponsorship for any refresher courses you need, plus a position on our emergency medicine staff if you want it." Malcolm stared at the envelope like it might bite him. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. We need doctors like you. Doctors who understand what it's like to be on both sides of the system. Who can teach the next generation to do better?" Malcolm took the envelope without opening it and walked back to Noah's room, his head spinning. Mrs. Patterson was reading a story in silly voices, making Noah giggle. The sound hit Malcolm square in the chest. "Daddy!" Noah's face lit up. "Did you tell them?" "I told them." "Did they listen?" Malcolm thought about the board members' faces, about the unanimous vote, about the envelope in his pocket that represented a door he'd slammed shut 6 years ago. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "I think maybe they did." Mrs. Patterson gathered her things with the reluctant efficiency of someone who knew when she wasn't needed anymore. She squeezed Malcolm's shoulder on her way out, whispering that she'd left some of Noah's favorite cookies in the drawer, the ones with the chocolate chips that were probably against hospital regulations, but who was going to tell? Noah fell asleep around 7 that evening, his small body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of fighting an infection that had nearly killed him. Malcolm sat in the chair beside the bed, the envelope from Caroline still unopened in his lap, and watched the monitors track his son's vital signs in their steady, reassuring rhythm. The door opened quietly, and Dr. Chen slipped in, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned to navigate hospital rooms without waking patients. "How's he doing?" Chen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good. Fever's been normal for 6 hours. He ate dinner, complained about the IV hurting, which I'm taking as a sign he's feeling better. Complaining is always a good sign." Chen glanced at the monitors, nodded his approval. "We'll probably be able to pull the IV tomorrow, switch him to oral antibiotics if he keeps tolerating food this well." Malcolm should have felt relief. Should have felt the tension that had been living in his shoulders for 2 days start to ease. Instead, he felt the weight of the envelope in his lap getting heavier. Chen noticed. Of course he noticed. The good ones always noticed. "That the offer from the hospital?" Chen asked, settling into the other visitor chair. "How'd you know about that?" Hospital gossip travels faster than airborne pathogens. Caroline's been telling everyone who'll listen about the mechanic who turned out to be a surgeon and saved his own kid's life. "You're kind of a legend right now." Malcolm huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Great. Always wanted to be famous for my son almost dying." "That's not what you're famous for. You're famous for knowing what needed to be done and doing it, regardless of who was listening. You're famous for standing in front of the board and making them face facts they'd been ignoring for years." Chen paused. "You're famous for being the kind of doctor this hospital desperately needs." "I'm not a doctor anymore." "Your hands were pretty doctorly when they were doing that LP. Your brain was pretty doctorly when you were calling out antibiotic dosages. Your instincts were pretty doctorly when you recognized bacterial meningitis from across a waiting room." Malcolm turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the possibility it represented. "You know what the worst part of being a doctor was?" Chen waited. "The helplessness. Everyone thinks doctors have all this power, all this control. But we don't. We're just people with some training, trying to fight biology and physics and time, and most of the time we lose. Maybe not immediately, maybe not that day, but eventually everyone we treat dies. Every single one. And we have to keep showing up anyway, keep fighting battles we know we can't ultimately win, keep caring about people we know we're going to lose." "That's not the worst part," Chen said quietly. "That's just the part that hurts the most." "What's the difference?" "The worst part would be not caring, not trying. letting people die because fighting for them is too hard. Chen leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Your wife. I'm guessing her death is what made you leave? Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Did you do everything you could to save her? Everything. More than everything. Called in every favor, tried every intervention, pushed so hard the attending had to physically pull me away from her bed because I wouldn't accept that she was gone. Then you didn't fail her, Malcolm. Medicine failed her. The human body, with all its fragility and randomness, failed her. But you didn't. Chen's voice was firm, insistent. And walking away from medicine because you couldn't save one person, even though that person meant everything to you, isn't protecting yourself from failure. It's guaranteeing it. Because every person you could have saved in the last 6 years and didn't, that's on you now. The words hit like a physical blow. Malcolm felt anger flare hot and immediate. That's not fair. No, it's not, Chen agreed. But neither is letting your son grow up thinking his father is just a mechanic when he's actually a brilliant surgeon who got scared. Neither is letting other kids die in waiting rooms because the people who could teach better protocols decided it was too painful to be in a hospital. Life isn't fair, Malcolm. You know that better than anyone. Malcolm wanted to argue, wanted to defend the choice he'd made 6 years ago, wanted to explain that survival sometimes meant running, and there was no shame in that. But Noah shifted in his sleep, made a small sound, and Malcolm's hand went automatically to check his forehead for fever. No fever. Just a kid sleeping, fighting off an infection with the help of antibiotics that Malcolm had known to order when no one else was moving fast enough. I don't know if I can do it, Malcolm said finally. Walk back into that world. Put on scrubs again. Be responsible for lives. You're already responsible for lives. You were responsible the moment you became a father. You were responsible last night when you saved Noah. You were responsible this afternoon when you stood in front of that board and demanded changes that will save people you'll never meet. Chen stood up, moved toward the door. The question isn't whether you're responsible. It's whether you're going to use your skills to meet that responsibility or keep hiding from it. After Chen left, Malcolm sat with those words echoing in his head, the envelope still unopened in his lap. He thought about Alicia, about the last time he'd seen her alive. She'd been laughing at something stupid he'd said, her hand on her enormous belly, telling him she couldn't wait to meet their son. 3 hours later, she was gone, and Malcolm was standing in a supply closet, still in his bloody scrubs, holding a newborn who would never know his mother. He'd made himself a promise that day. He'd promised that he would never put himself in a position to feel that powerless again, that he would never care so much about a patient that losing them would destroy him, that he would find a safer, smaller life where the stakes weren't life and death, and the failures didn't carve pieces out of his soul. He'd kept that promise for 6 years, and it had nearly cost him his son. Malcolm opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter on hospital letterhead, offering full sponsorship for medical license reinstatement, including any required continuing education courses, skills assessments, and board recertification exams. Below that was a proposed employment contract for a position as an attending physician in emergency medicine, with a salary that made his eyes widen. And beneath that was a handwritten note from Caroline. You saved your son because you refused to be invisible, the note read. Now you have a chance to save others by making sure they're never treated as invisible either. I hope you'll take it. We need you. They need you. And I think maybe you need this too. Malcolm folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. He wasn't ready to decide. Wasn't ready to say yes to a future that terrified him as much as it called to something deep in his chest that he'd thought was dead. But he didn't throw the envelope away either. The next 3 days passed in the strange, suspended time of hospital vigils. Noah improved steadily, his fever staying down, his appetite returning, his energy rebuilding until the nurses had to keep reminding him not to run in the halls. The IV came out on day 3. The antibiotics were switched to oral on day 4. And on day 5, Dr. Chen signed the discharge papers with a smile that said he'd never doubted the outcome, though Malcolm had seen the worry in his eyes that first night. Home care instructions are pretty straightforward, Chen said, handing Malcolm a folder full of papers. Finish the full course of antibiotics even if he's feeling better. Rest for at least a week. No school. Follow up with his pediatrician in 3 days, then again in 2 weeks. Any sign of fever, headache, stiff neck, you bring him straight back. I will. Malcolm helped Noah into the wheelchair hospital policy required, even though the kid was bouncing with excitement to leave. And Chen? Thank you for everything. Thank me by thinking about that offer. We could use you around here. Malcolm signed the discharge papers and wheeled Noah out through corridors that felt different now than they had 5 days ago. Before, they'd been the site of trauma and fear and nearly losing everything. Now they were just hallways in a hospital where his son had gotten better, where doctors had done their jobs, where life had decided to give them another chance. The automatic doors opened onto a bright afternoon. Malcolm's truck was where he'd left it in the emergency parking, probably with a dozen tickets under the windshield, though he couldn't bring himself to care. He helped Noah into the passenger seat, buckled him in carefully, and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. "Dad?" Noah's voice was uncertain. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, buddy, just tired." "Can we get pizza on the way home? Hospital food was gross." Malcolm laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. "Yeah, we can get pizza." They drove through the city with the windows down. Noah chattering about everything he was going to tell his friends at school, about how he'd been so sick he needed special medicine, about how his dad had been a secret doctor the whole time. Malcolm listened and drove and felt the knot in his chest slowly start to loosen. The pizza place was a hole in the wall near their apartment, the kind of place where they knew Malcolm's order by heart. They got a large pepperoni and ate it at one of the wobbly tables, while Noah told the owner, Mr. Rossetti, the entire saga of his hospital stay with dramatic embellishments that made the seizures sound like something from a movie. "Your papa! He saved your life," Mr. Rossetti said, looking at Malcolm with new respect. "That's something special." "He used to be a doctor," Noah said proudly. "A real one. In a hospital, and everything." "Is that so?" Mr. Rossetti wiped his hands on his apron. "Why you fix cars now instead of people?" It was the question everyone would ask, Malcolm realized. The question he'd have to answer over and over if he took the hospital's offer. The question he'd have to answer to himself first. "It's complicated," Malcolm said, which was what he always said. "Life is complicated," Mr. Rossetti agreed. "But pizza is simple. You want another slice, you take another slice. You want to be a doctor, you be a doctor. Sometimes the answer is just to do the thing you know you should do." If only it were that simple, Malcolm thought, but he didn't say it out loud. They got home around 7. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it 5 days ago, frozen in the moment when Malcolm had scooped up a feverish Noah and rushed him to the hospital. Noah's homework was still on the kitchen table. Malcolm's coffee cup still sat in the sink. The normalcy of it felt surreal after days in the antiseptic unreality of the hospital. Malcolm got Noah settled on the couch with his favorite blanket and a movie, then stood in the kitchen and looked at his life. The apartment was small but clean, the furniture secondhand but comfortable. Photos of Noah covered the refrigerator, documenting 6 years of birthdays and school plays and Little League games. There were no photos of Alicia. Malcolm had packed those away after she died, unable to look at her smile and remember that she was gone. His phone rang. The shop. Malcolm had left his assistant manager, Tommy, in charge for 5 days without much explanation beyond a family emergency. "Boss, thank God, how's Noah?" "Better. We just got home from the hospital." "Hospital? Man, I thought he just had the flu or something. Is he okay?" "He will be. It was bacterial meningitis, but they caught it in time." Malcolm didn't mention his own role in the catching. "How's the shop?" "Running smooth. We finished the brake job on the Honda, started the transmission rebuild on the Chevy. Mrs. Chen called about her Accord making that noise again. I told her you'd call her back when you could." Tommy paused. "Listen, boss, take all the time you need. Me and the guys got this covered." Malcolm felt a rush of gratitude for Tommy, who was 23 and learning the business and never questioned why Malcolm ran the shop the way he did. "I appreciate that. I'll be back Monday." "No rush. Family comes first." Malcolm hung up and looked at the envelope from the hospital, which he'd set on the counter. Family comes first. It was what everyone said, what everyone believed. But what did it mean when putting family first might mean leaving the small, safe life he'd built and walking back into the fire? "Dad?" Noah called from the living room. "Can you watch the movie with me?" Malcolm left the envelope where it was and joined his son on the couch. They watched animated characters save the world with courage and friendship and the kind of clear-cut morality that only existed in children's movies. Noah fell asleep halfway through, his head on Malcolm's shoulder, and Malcolm sat there holding him and thinking about choices and consequences and all the ways life pushed you toward the things you were running from. The weekend passed quietly. Noah's energy came back in waves, bursts of his normal chaos followed by sudden exhaustion that reminded Malcolm how close they'd come to losing this. They played board games and watched movies and ate too much junk food. Mrs. Patterson came by with a casserole and stayed for dinner, asking gentle questions about the hospital that Malcolm answered vaguely. Denise stopped in with flowers and a stuffed animal for Noah, her eyes guilty when she looked at Malcolm. "I should have done more," she said quietly, while Noah was in his room playing. "When I saw you in that waiting room, I should have made Caroline listen. It's not your fault. Maybe not, but I knew how she could be and I didn't fight hard enough. I'm sorry." Malcolm didn't know what to say to that. Sorry was such a small word for such big failures, but it was all anyone could offer in the end. Sunday night, after Noah was asleep, Malcolm finally took out the envelope and read through all the documents carefully. The license reinstatement process would take about 3 months, assuming he could pass the required exams and skills assessments. The hospital was offering to pay for everything, including a review course that started in 2 weeks. The job offer was contingent on successful reinstatement, but included a signing bonus and benefits that were far better than anything he'd had as a resident. It was a good offer, more than good. It was a lifeline back to the person he used to be. Malcolm picked up his phone and called the number at the bottom of Caroline's note. She answered on the second ring, her voice professionally crisp even on a Sunday night. "Caroline Whitmore." "It's Malcolm Reed." Her voice changed immediately, warming. "Malcolm, how's Noah?" "Home. Better. Still tired, but better." "I'm so glad. I've been thinking about you both." Malcolm looked at the documents spread across his kitchen table, at the life they represented. "I got the offer, the license reinstatement, the job. And I need to know what you really want from me, because this feels like more than just hiring another ER doc." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "You're right. It is more than that. Malcolm, the board approved the triage protocol changes, but implementation is already hitting resistance. Staff who don't want to admit there's been a problem. Administrators who think bias training is a waste of time. People who are very good at looking like they're making changes while actually maintaining the status quo. So you want me to be your diversity hire? The black doctor you can point to and say, 'See, we're not racist'? No." Caroline's voice was sharp. "I want you to be the person who holds us accountable, who can call out the subtle ways bias creeps in even when people think they're being fair, who can teach our residents and attendings what it feels like to be dismissed and ignored so they never do it to someone else. I want you to be the conscience this hospital needs, Malcolm. Not because you're black, but because you've been on both sides of the power dynamic and you understand how easily the system fails people." Malcolm closed his eyes, felt the weight of what she was asking. "That's a hell of a job description." "I know. And it's not fair to put it on you. You didn't ask to be the person who experienced this. You didn't ask to have the skills and knowledge and perspective that make you uniquely qualified to help fix it." She paused. "But you have those things. And we need them. People need them. Kids like Noah need them." "I don't know if I can be a doctor again," Malcolm said honestly. "I don't know if I can walk into a trauma bay and make life or death decisions and carry that weight. I'm not asking you to know. I'm asking you to try. To take the courses, sit for the exams, see if it's still in you." Caroline's voice softened. "What's the worst that happens? You go through the reinstatement process and decide it's not for you? You're not legally bound to take the job. You can walk away at any point. And the best that happens? You save lives. You change the culture of medicine. You show your son what it looks like to face the thing that scares you and do it anyway." Malcolm opened his eyes and looked at the photo on his refrigerator. Noah at age 3, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a toy stethoscope Malcolm had bought him on a whim. He'd told himself at the time that it was just a toy, that it didn't mean anything, but he'd kept it, and sometimes he'd catch Noah playing doctor with his stuffed animals, using words he'd picked up from overhearing Malcolm talk to himself about medical shows on TV. "I need a few days to think about it," Malcolm said. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." After they hung up, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at the documents, thinking about choices and fear and all the ways grief could trap you in a half-life where you were safe but not really living. Monday morning, Malcolm dropped Noah off at Mrs. Patterson's despite the boy's protests that he was well enough to go to school. Doctor's orders, Malcolm said firmly. 1 week of rest. That means no school. But I'm bored. Then be bored. Watch TV, color, play video games. But you're not going to school until Friday at the earliest. Mrs. Patterson took Noah with practiced ease, already suggesting projects and activities that would keep him occupied. Malcolm drove to the shop, parked in his usual spot, and stood for a moment looking at the sign he'd painted himself 6 years ago. Reed's Auto Repair. Honest work, fair prices. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. A life he'd built from scratch, where success was measured in satisfied customers and fixed engines and the simple pride of solving mechanical problems. Tommy met him at the door with a clipboard full of work orders. "Welcome back, boss. Got a full slate today. The Chevy's ready for you to look at, and we got a weird electrical issue on a BMW that I can't figure out." Malcolm took the clipboard and felt the familiar rhythm of the shop settle around him like a comfortable coat. This was what he knew. This was safe. But all day as he diagnosed problems and ordered parts and got his hands dirty with the honest grime of mechanical work, part of his brain was elsewhere, thinking about triage protocols and bias training, thinking about residents who needed to learn better, thinking about kids in waiting rooms whose parents weren't doctors and couldn't fight the system the way Malcolm had. Around 3, during his lunch break, Malcolm pulled out his phone and scrolled through medical news sites. He'd been doing this for 6 years, reading journals, following developments, keeping up with the field he'd left behind. He told himself it was just intellectual curiosity, just staying informed. But maybe it had been something else. Maybe it had been hope. Tommy found him in the office, staring at an article about new sepsis protocols. "You okay, boss? You've been weird since you got back." Malcolm looked up at the kid who'd been working for him for 2 years, who Malcolm had taught everything he knew about transmissions and brakes and the art of customer service. Tommy was good. Would be great eventually. Could run this shop himself if he had to. "Can I ask you something?" Malcolm said. "And I need you to be honest." "Sure, boss." "If I wasn't here, could you run this place?" Tommy blinked, surprise and fear crossing his face in quick succession. "Are you firing me?" "No, just answer the question." "I mean, yeah, I think so. I know the work, know the customers. Would take some getting used to, the business side of things, but I could learn." Tommy's eyes narrowed. "Why? You going somewhere?" Malcolm looked at the article on his phone, then at the shop through the office window, then at Tommy. "I might be. Maybe. I don't know yet." "This about Noah being sick?" "This about a lot of things." Malcolm set his phone down. "You know I used to be a doctor, right?" "Yeah, you mentioned it once. Ages ago. The hospital where Noah was treated offered me my job back. Well, not back exactly. A new job. Teaching. Clinical work. They want to help me get my license reinstated." Tommy let out a low whistle. "That's big." "Yeah. You gonna take it?" "I don't know. This place is... It's what I built after everything fell apart. It's safe. I know what I'm doing here." "But," Tommy prompted, "but I saved my son's life because I remembered how to be a doctor. And if I remembered that, maybe I remember the other parts too. The good parts. The parts that mattered." Tommy leaned against the doorframe, studying Malcolm with the kind of perception that made him good at diagnosing engine problems. "Boss, you've taught me a lot about cars, but you've also taught me that doing good work matters, that showing up for people matters, that using your skills to help folks who need it matters." He shrugged. "Seems to me that applies whether you're fixing cars or fixing people." Out of the mouths of 23-year-olds, Malcolm felt something shift in his chest, some weight he'd been carrying for 6 years starting to redistribute itself. "If I did this," Malcolm said slowly, "it would take at least 3 months before I could start, maybe longer. And I'd need someone to run the shop while I'm studying, taking exams, someone I could trust not to let it fall apart." Tommy's eyes widened. "You want me to—" "I want you to manage it. I'd still own it, still be around when I could, but you'd be running day-to-day operations, hiring, ordering, customer service, the works." Malcolm watched the kid process this. "You interested?" "Hell yes, I'm interested, but Boss, are you sure? This is your whole life. No, Malcolm said quietly. This is part of my life, but it's not all of it. And maybe it's time I stopped pretending it was. He called Caroline that evening after Noah was in bed, after he'd sat with the decision for hours, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together but somehow made a picture anyway. I'll do it, he said when she answered. The license reinstatement. I'll take the courses, sit for the exams. If I pass, if I can still do this, then we'll talk about the job. He could hear the smile in Caroline's voice. Thank you, Malcolm. You won't regret this. I might, he said honestly, but I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me. The review course started 2 weeks later in a lecture hall at Emory that Malcolm remembered from his residency. Same uncomfortable chairs, same fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, same nervous energy of people whose careers depended on passing exams. Except this time, Malcolm was a decade older than most of his classmates, and the grease under his fingernails wouldn't quite come clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. The instructor was Dr. Patricia Hammond, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for failing anyone who couldn't keep up. She looked at the roster on her first day, then looked up at the class of 15 doctors seeking license reinstatement. You're all here because something interrupted your medical careers, she said without preamble. Maybe it was family, maybe it was illness, maybe it was burnout or disillusionment or a complete mental breakdown. I don't care what it was. What I care about is whether you still have what it takes to practice medicine safely and competently. Her gaze landed on Malcolm and held. Some of you have been out of practice for a few months. Some of you for years. The medicine you learned is outdated. The protocols have changed. The technology has evolved. Your job for the next 12 weeks is to catch up on everything you missed and prove you can still cut it. My job is to make sure you do, or fail you if you can't. Questions? No one had questions. Malcolm felt his stomach tighten with a familiar mix of anxiety and anticipation that he hadn't experienced in 6 years. This was what medical training felt like: constant evaluation, constant pressure, the knowledge that every exam and every practical assessment was a referendum on whether you deserved to call yourself a doctor. He'd missed it. He hadn't realized how much until right now. The first week was brutal. 8 hours a day of lectures covering everything from new pharmacology to updated trauma protocols to the latest research on sepsis management. Malcolm's brain felt rusty, like an engine that had been sitting too long and needed time to warm up. He took notes furiously, recorded lectures to listen to while driving, stayed up late reading textbooks that made his eyes burn. Noah noticed immediately. "You're acting weird," the boy said one evening, watching Malcolm highlight passages in a pharmacology text while they ate dinner. "You're like, school weird." "I'm studying, buddy. Remember I told you I'm taking classes to be a doctor again?" "But you're already a doctor. You saved my life." "I used to be a doctor. Now I have to prove I can still do it." Malcolm set down his highlighter and gave Noah his full attention. "It's like if you stopped playing baseball for 6 years and then wanted to join a team again. You'd have to practice, right? Show the coach you still knew how to play?" Noah considered this. "I guess, but you'd still know how. It's just remembering." If only it were that simple, Malcolm thought. But muscle memory and intellectual knowledge weren't the same thing. He could remember how to insert a chest tube, but could he do it under pressure with a patient coding in front of him? He could recall the pharmacology of common medications, but could he make split-second decisions about drug interactions and dosing in an emergency? The answer had to be yes. Failure wasn't an option, not when he'd already told Tommy to prepare to run the shop, not when he'd already committed to Caroline that he'd try, not when Noah was watching him with eyes that said his father could do anything. The second week brought practical assessments. They started with basic skills: IV insertion, intubation on mannequins, suturing pigs' feet. Malcolm's hands remembered before his brain caught up, finding the angles and applying the pressure with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done these procedures hundreds of times. "Good technique," Dr. Hammond said, watching him place a central line on a simulation dummy. "You've clearly done this before." 5 years at Grady," Malcolm said, focused on threading the catheter. "Trauma surgery. Did enough central lines that I could probably do them in my sleep." "Grady, doctor." Hammond's tone shifted, gaining a note of respect. "That's serious training. Why'd you leave? Malcolm secured the line and disposed of his gloves before answering. Personal reasons. Those must have been some serious personal reasons to walk away from a Grady trauma position. Malcolm met her eyes. They were. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, you haven't lost your skills. That's something, but skills aren't everything. Medicine has changed in 6 years, Reed. You're going to need to prove you can adapt. The adaptation came in week 3 when they started case-based learning, complex scenarios that required not just technical skills, but clinical reasoning, differential diagnosis, the ability to synthesize information and make decisions under pressure. This was where Malcolm had always excelled, where his brain worked the way it was designed to work, taking symptoms and test results and patient history and weaving them into a coherent picture that pointed toward treatment. His first case was a 52-year-old woman presenting with chest pain and shortness of breath. Malcolm ran through the differential in his head, MI, PE, aortic dissection, pneumothorax, and started asking for the information he needed to narrow it down. Vital signs, EKG, chest X-ray, lab work. Each piece of data shifted the probabilities, adjusted his thinking. Diagnosis, Dr. Hammond asked after he'd reviewed all the information. Pulmonary embolism. Large clot, probably saddle embolus given the severity of symptoms. She needs immediate anticoagulation and a CT angio to confirm. If she's unstable, we might be looking at thrombolytics or even surgical embolectomy. Our treatment plan? Malcolm walked her through it step by step. Stabilize the airway, oxygen, IV access, heparin bolus followed by continuous infusion, urgent imaging, ICU admission. He could see it all playing out like he was actually in the trauma bay, could feel the adrenaline of the emergency, the focus that came with knowing exactly what needed to happen and in what order. When he finished, Dr. Hammond was nodding slowly. That's textbook perfect. You've still got it, Reed. But having it in a classroom wasn't the same as having it in real life, and Malcolm knew it. Knowing the right answer when you had time to think was different from making split-second decisions when a patient was crashing in front of you. Different from managing the chaos of a busy ER where 3 emergencies were happening simultaneously. And you had to triage not just patients, but your own attention and energy. That reality hit home in week 5 when they did their first shift observations. Malcolm was assigned to shadow Dr. Chen in the Mercy General ER, watching but not participating, seeing how the department had changed since his own training. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Organized chaos. The kind of chaos Malcolm had once navigated with ease. Patients coming in with everything from minor cuts to major traumas. Nurses moving between rooms with practiced efficiency. Residents presenting cases to attendings. The constant hum of monitors and conversations and the PA system calling codes. And there, in the middle of it all, was Caroline Whitmore. Not in her board director suit, but in scrubs, her hair pulled back, moving through the department with a tablet in hand and a determined expression. She spotted Malcolm and made her way over. Reed, how's the training going? Good. Harder than I expected, but good. Dr. Hammond says you're top of the class. Dr. Hammond says a lot of things. Caroline smiled. She does, but in this case, she's right. She also says you're ready for supervised clinical practice. She glanced at Dr. Chen, who'd appeared at Malcolm's elbow. What do you think, David? Ready to let him get his hands dirty? Dr. Chen looked at Malcolm appraisingly. You completed your skills assessments? Passed everything. And you've been cleared by the board for supervised practice pending full reinstatement? As of yesterday. Then yeah, I'd say he's ready. Dr. Chen gestured toward the board showing patient assignments. We've got a full house today. Perfect opportunity to see if classroom knowledge translates to clinical competence. Malcolm felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The moment where theory became practice, where remembering became doing. Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Chen said, already walking. 28-year-old male, motorcycle versus car. Unconscious at the scene, GCS 6, ETA 3 minutes. Malcolm followed, his body moving on autopilot toward the trauma bay while his mind cataloged what GCS 6 meant. Severe traumatic brain injury, unresponsive to verbal stimuli, only pain response. This patient was critical. The trauma bay was already prepped, the team assembling. 2 nurses, a respiratory therapist, a radiology tech with the portable X-ray machine, a resident who looked fresh out of medical school. They all looked at Malcolm, registering his presence but clearly uncertain about his role. "This is Dr. Reed," Chen said. "He's doing supervised clinical observation. Reed, you're going to run this trauma. I'll be here watching, but you make the calls. Everyone else, you take your orders from him. Clear?" The team nodded, but Malcolm could see the skepticism in their eyes. Who was this guy they'd never seen before? Why was Chen letting him run a major trauma? No time to worry about it. The doors burst open and the paramedics rushed in with the patient on a backboard, rattling off vitals and injuries while they transferred him to the trauma bed. Malcolm's vision narrowed to the patient, to the work. Everything else fell away. "Airway first," he said, his voice steady and clear. "He's not protecting it. I need an intubation kit. Someone get me a 7.5 tube." His hands were already moving, positioning the patient's head, checking for obstruction. The respiratory therapist handed him the laryngoscope, and he inserted it smoothly, visualizing the vocal cords, sliding the tube into place with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 100 times. "I'm in. Inflate the cuff. Someone confirm placement." The respiratory therapist listened to both lung fields. Equal breath sounds bilaterally. "Good. Get him on the vent." Malcolm was already moving to the next priority. 2 large-bore IVs, both arms. "I want 4 units of O- standing by. Get me a trauma panel, type and cross for 6 units. Someone call the OR and tell them we might be coming up. And I need imaging, chest, pelvis, C-spine to start." The team moved with synchronized efficiency, everyone knowing their role. Malcolm watched the monitors, watched the patient, cataloged every piece of information as it came in. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate climbing, classic signs of hemorrhagic shock. "He's bleeding somewhere," Malcolm said, his hands palpating the abdomen, rigid, distended. "Abdomen's positive, likely splenic or hepatic injury. We need to get him to the OR now." "Fast exam first," the resident suggested hesitantly. "No time. Clinical diagnosis is good enough. His pressure's 80/40 and dropping. Every minute we wait his blood we can't replace fast enough." Malcolm looked at Dr. Chen, who nodded approval. "Call surgery. Tell them we have a trauma lap coming up emergent." The next 10 minutes were controlled chaos as they stabilized the patient enough for transport, pushed fluids and blood products, and got him upstairs to surgery. When the OR team took over, Malcolm stepped back and felt the adrenaline crash hit him like a wave. His hands were shaking, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the sheer intensity of what he'd just done. From the weight of being responsible for someone's life again. "Doctor," Chen clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice work. That was textbook trauma management." "Did I miss anything?" "Not a thing. You were decisive, clear, prioritized correctly. That kid's alive because you knew what to do and didn't hesitate to do it." Chen studied him. "How do you feel?" Malcolm looked at his shaking hands, felt his racing heart, tasted the familiar copper tang of fear mixed with exhilaration. Terrified. Alive. Like I remembered something I'd forgotten I knew. That's how it should feel. The day it stops feeling like that is the day you should quit. Chen pulled off his gloves and tossed them in the trash. "You ready for another one? Because we've got a full board." They worked 6 more cases that shift, none as critical as the motorcycle trauma, but each one requiring clinical judgment, procedural skills, the ability to manage multiple moving pieces while staying calm and focused. A diabetic in DKA who needed careful fluid management and insulin titration. A child with suspected appendicitis who needed gentle questioning and a parent who needed reassurance. An elderly woman with a hip fracture who reminded Malcolm so painfully of his own mother that he had to take a breath before he could speak to her without his voice breaking. By the end of the shift, Malcolm was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of caring, of being responsible, of making decisions that mattered. It was the exhaustion he'd run away from 6 years ago. But it was also exhilarating, being needed, being competent, making a difference in people's lives in a tangible, immediate way that fixing cars never quite matched. "So?" Caroline appeared as Malcolm was leaving the ER, her tablet tucked under her arm. "How was your first day back?" "Intense, good, scary." Malcolm flexed his hands, which had finally stopped shaking. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be this tired and this wired at the same time. That's emergency medicine. It's addictive once you remember why you loved it. She fell into step beside him as he walked toward the parking garage. Dr. Chen said you were excellent, said you handled that motorcycle trauma like you'd never stopped practicing. Chen's being generous. Chen doesn't do generous, he does honest. And Caroline stopped at the elevator bank. Malcolm, I know this is hard. I know coming back to medicine means facing things you ran away from. But you're doing it. You're actually doing it. I haven't passed the boards yet, haven't even sat for the exam. You will. And when you do, we want you here. Not just because you're skilled, though you clearly are, but because you understand what it's like to be on both sides of the system. Because you'll never let a patient be invisible the way you were made invisible. Malcolm thought about the elderly woman with the hip fracture, about how one of the nurses had started to dismiss her pain as just arthritis until Malcolm had quietly insisted on x-rays, about the diabetic patient who'd been embarrassed about not being able to afford his insulin and how Malcolm had spent extra time connecting him with financial assistance programs, about all the small ways that bias and assumption crept into medicine even when people were trying to do their best. I want to make a difference, he said finally, but I also want to not screw up and kill someone. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, the first requires the second. Caroline smiled. Go home. Rest. Come back Monday and keep learning. That's all anyone can ask. Malcolm drove home through Atlanta traffic with his windows down and his mind racing. He kept replaying the trauma, analyzing every decision, questioning whether he'd done everything right. Could he have intubated faster? Should he have ordered the fast exam despite the time pressure? Had he missed anything in his physical assessment? This was the curse of medical knowledge. You could always second-guess yourself, always find things you might have done differently. The key was learning to distinguish between productive self-reflection and destructive self-doubt. Noah was at Mrs. Patterson's when Malcolm got home. He picked the boy up, listened to a detailed recap of Noah's day that involved recess politics and a disputed call in kickball, and felt the normalcy of it ground him back in the life he'd built. How was your doctor school? Noah asked over dinner. Good. I got to work in the hospital today, helped take care of people who were sick or hurt. Did you save anyone's life? Malcolm thought about the motorcycle trauma, about the kid who was probably in surgery right now, about whether he'd make it through the night. Maybe. I hope so. That's so cool. Are you going to be a doctor again for real? If I pass my exams, yeah. I'll be a real doctor again. Noah beamed. Can I tell my class? For show and tell? The simple pride in his son's voice made Malcolm's throat tight. Sure, buddy. You can tell your class. The next 8 weeks blurred together in a relentless cycle of studying, exams, and clinical shifts. Malcolm's brain felt like it was rewiring itself, creating new neural pathways to accommodate all the information it was absorbing. New drugs with names he could barely pronounce. New protocols that replaced the ones he'd memorized years ago. New technology that made diagnosis faster and more accurate, but also more complex. He was the oldest student in the review course by a decade, and sometimes he felt it in his bones. Felt the weight of experience that the younger doctors didn't carry. Felt the grief and loss that informed every clinical decision he made. But he also had something they didn't. A deep well of motivation born from nearly losing his son, from understanding exactly what happened when the system failed people. Doctor. Hammond pulled him aside after a particularly difficult case presentation in week 10. You're doing excellent work, Reed. Best in the class, if I'm being honest. Thank you. But I'm worried about you. Malcolm looked up from his notes. Why? Because you carry every case like it's personal. Every patient like they're your own family. That kind of emotional investment will destroy you in emergency medicine. You have to learn to compartmentalize, to not take every bad outcome home with you. Malcolm thought about Alicia, about how he'd been unable to compartmentalize when she died, how it had broken him so completely that he'd fled medicine altogether. Hammond was right. If he couldn't learn to protect himself emotionally, he'd burn out within a year. How do you do it? He asked. How do you care enough to do good work, but not so much that it destroys you? Hammond considered the question carefully. You acknowledge that you can't save everyone. You do your absolute best with every patient, and then you let go of the outcome. You control what you can control, your skills, your decisions, your compassion, and you accept that the rest is up to biology and luck and factors beyond your influence. That sounds like giving up. It's not giving up. It's survival. It's the difference between a 20-year career and a 2-year burnout. Hammond's voice softened. You lost someone, didn't you? Someone important. That's why you left medicine. Malcolm nodded, not trusting his voice. Then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know what happens when you can't separate yourself from the outcome. And you have a choice now. You can learn to build those boundaries, or you can walk away again before it breaks you a second time. The words haunted Malcolm through his final weeks of preparation. He thought about them during his clinical shifts when he had to pronounce a cardiac arrest patient dead despite 30 minutes of resuscitation. Thought about them when a child came in with injuries that were clearly abuse and he had to stay professional while filing the mandatory reports. Thought about them when he held the hand of a woman dying of cancer and knew there was nothing he could do but make her comfortable. Each time he practiced letting go, acknowledging the grief without drowning in it, feeling the pain without letting it paralyze him. It was the hardest work he'd ever done, harder than any exam or procedure, this constant calibration between compassion and self-preservation. The board examination was scheduled for the second week of December, a brutal 8-hour marathon of multiple-choice questions covering every aspect of emergency medicine. Malcolm studied until his eyes burned and his head ached, until he dreamed in medical terminology and woke up reciting drug dosages. The night before the exam, Noah found him at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and review materials. "Dad, you're going to do great. You're the smartest person I know." Malcolm pulled his son into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of kid shampoo and the lavender detergent Mrs. Patterson used on their laundry. "Thanks, buddy. But smart doesn't always mean you pass the test." "You saved my life. That's harder than any test." Out of the mouths of babes. Malcolm held his son tighter and let himself believe it might be true. The exam was every bit as brutal as he'd anticipated. Questions that required not just knowledge, but the ability to synthesize information, to think critically, to make the same kinds of judgment calls he'd been practicing in clinical shifts. Malcolm moved through them methodically, trusting his training, trusting the work he'd done over the past 3 months. When he finished and submitted his answers, he felt emptied out, wrung dry. It would be 4 weeks before he got his results. 4 weeks of waiting to find out if he'd passed, if he could reclaim his license, if he could step back into the world he'd left behind. He drove home in a daze and found Tommy at the shop, closing up for the day. "How'd it go, boss?" "Ask me in 4 weeks when I know if I passed." "You passed. No way you didn't." Tommy locked the front door and pocketed the keys. "Shop's doing good, by the way. Revenue's up 12% from last quarter. Mrs. Chen finally let me fix that noise in her Accord. Turned out to be exactly what you said it was. And I hired a new kid to help with oil changes. Hope that's okay?" Malcolm looked at his shop, at the life he'd built here, at Tommy who was running it better than Malcolm had expected. "More than okay. You're doing great work. Learn from the best." Tommy headed for his car, then turned back. "Hey boss, whatever happens with the doctor thing, you're always going to be a mechanic. You taught me that skills don't disappear just because you stop using them for a while. They're always there, waiting for you to pick them up again." After Tommy left, Malcolm stood in the empty garage and thought about skills and identity, about all the ways a person could be more than one thing at once. He was a father and a mechanic, and maybe, if he'd passed the exam, he'd be a doctor again too. None of those identities erased the others. They just added layers, complexity, depth. 4 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, while Malcolm was replacing a timing belt on a Honda, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him wipe his hands and pick up. "Malcolm Reed?" "Speaking. This is the Georgia Medical Board. I'm calling about your licensing examination results." Malcolm's heart stopped. "Yes?" "Congratulations, Dr. Reed. You passed. Your license has been reinstated, effective immediately. You should receive your official documentation within 5 business days." Malcolm stood in his garage, grease on his hands and hope in his chest, and felt the final piece click into place. He'd done it. After 6 years of running, of hiding, of pretending he was someone he wasn't, he'd found his way back. Now he just had to figure out what came next. Malcolm stood in his garage holding the phone long after the medical board representative had hung up, the words Dr. Reed still echoing in his head like something from another lifetime. Through the open bay door, he could see Atlanta's afternoon sun slanting across the parking lot, painting everything in shades of gold that made the ordinary world look almost sacred. "Boss?" Tommy's voice cut through his reverie. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I passed," Malcolm said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "The exam. I passed." Tommy's face split into a grin. "I knew it. Man, I knew you'd pass. So what happens now? You hanging up your wrenches for good?" Malcolm looked around the garage, at the lifts and tool chests, and the Honda still waiting for its timing belt, at the life he'd built from the wreckage of the one he'd lost. "I don't know yet. I need to talk to some people." The first call he made was to Noah's school. He got permission to pull the boy out early, and when Noah climbed into the truck with his backpack and a suspicious look, Malcolm couldn't stop smiling. "Am I in trouble?" Noah asked. "No, buddy. The opposite of trouble." Malcolm pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward their favorite ice cream place. "I got some news today. Remember those doctor tests I was taking? You passed!" Noah's face lit up with absolute certainty. "I knew you would. You're the smartest dad ever." "I don't know about smartest, but I did pass, which means I'm officially a doctor again. Can you start tomorrow?" Malcolm laughed at the simplicity of childhood logic. "It's a little more complicated than that. I have to decide if I want to take the job at the hospital. It would mean big changes for us." They got ice cream, chocolate chip for Noah, coffee for Malcolm, and sat at one of the outdoor tables while Malcolm tried to explain what the decision actually meant. More money, but less time together. Important work, but work that would sometimes keep him at the hospital overnight. A chance to make a real difference, but also a chance to fail in ways that would hurt people. "Would you be happy?" Noah asked, ice cream dotting his upper lip. The question was so direct, so simple, that it cut through all of Malcolm's circular thinking and hit the heart of the matter. "I think so," Malcolm said slowly. "I think I'd be doing something I'm good at, something that matters. But I'd miss seeing you as much. I'd miss our mornings and some of our evenings. You'd have to spend more time with Mrs. Patterson." Noah considered this while working on his cone. "Mrs. Patterson's nice, and Dad, you were really happy when you were studying, like really happy, even when you were tired and stressed. You'd get this look on your face, like when I beat the hard level on my video game." Malcolm felt his throat tighten. His 6-year-old son had seen what he'd been trying not to admit to himself, that reclaiming medicine had woken something up inside him that had been dormant for too long. "You're pretty smart yourself, you know that?" "I get it from you." Noah grinned, then grew more serious. "I think you should be a doctor again. I think Mom would want you to." The mention of Alicia hit Malcolm like a physical blow. They didn't talk about her often. It was too hard, too complicated, and Noah had been too young when she died to have real memories. But sometimes the boy surprised him with these moments of insight that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his 6 years. "What makes you say that?" Malcolm asked quietly. "Because Mrs. Patterson told me Mom was a teacher, that she loved helping kids learn things. And you're like that, but with making people better instead of smarter." Noah licked ice cream from his fingers. "She'd want you to help people, I think, even if it's hard." Malcolm pulled his son close, not caring about the ice cream getting on his work shirt, and let himself feel the grief and love and possibility all tangled together. Alicia had loved teaching with a fierce passion that sometimes made her stay up late grading papers or spend her own money on classroom supplies. She'd believed that helping others was the most important work anyone could do. And she'd loved Malcolm for his skills and his compassion and his refusal to give up on difficult cases. She would have hated that he'd walked away from medicine, would have understood it, would have held him through the grief, but would have eventually pushed him back toward the work he loved. Maybe this was her pushing him now, through their son's simple wisdom. "Okay," Malcolm said. "Okay, I'll do it." His second call was to Caroline Whitmore, who answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "Malcolm, please tell me you have good news." "I passed. License is reinstated." He heard her exhale in relief. "I knew you would. When can you start?" "That's what I need to talk to you about. I'm not giving up the shop completely. Tommy can run day-to-day operations, but I want to keep ownership, keep my hand in it. So I can't do full-time emergency medicine. Not yet, maybe not ever." There was a pause, and Malcolm braced himself for disappointment. But when Caroline spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than frustrated. What if we structured it differently? 3 12-hour shifts a week in the ER, plus you lead the bias training program for residents and attendings. That's 44 hours, which technically counts as full-time in emergency medicine. It would give you time for the shop and for Noah, and still let you make a real impact here. Malcolm did the math. 3 12-hour shifts meant 3 days a week away from Noah, but 4 days at home. It meant keeping the shop alive while also reclaiming medicine. It meant not having to choose between his two identities, but instead finding a way to honor both. That could work, he said. When would you need me to start? How does January 1st sound? New year, new beginning, gives you time to get things sorted with the shop and with Noah's childcare. And Malcolm, thank you for coming back, for being willing to try. After he hung up, Malcolm sat with Noah finishing their ice cream and watching the world move around them. People going about their ordinary lives, unaware that Malcolm's life had just tilted on its axis and rearranged itself into something he'd never quite imagined. Not the surgeon he'd been before, not the mechanic he'd become after, but some hybrid of both. A doctor who understood what it meant to work with his hands. A father who'd learned that running from pain only meant carrying it differently. The next few weeks moved with the strange momentum of change that had been building for months, finally breaking through. Malcolm met with the hospital's HR department to finalize his contract. He worked with Tommy to restructure the shop's management, training him on the business side while the kid already knew the mechanical work. He talked to Noah's school and Mrs. Patterson about the new schedule. He bought new scrubs and tried not to feel like he was wearing a costume. And he went back to Mercy General on a cold December afternoon to meet with the team he'd be training. Caroline had assembled 15 doctors in a conference room, a mix of residents and younger attendings who'd been identified as needing additional education on implicit bias and patient advocacy. They looked skeptical when Malcolm walked in wearing jeans and a button-down instead of the white coat they'd probably expected. "This is Dr. Malcolm Reed," Caroline said from the front of the room. "He's going to be leading our new training program on equitable patient care. Some of you may have heard about the incident in our ER a few months ago that led to these reforms. Dr. Reed was directly involved in that incident. He's also a trauma surgeon who practiced at Grady before taking a 6-year hiatus, and he's recently completed license reinstatement. Starting in January, he'll be joining our ER staff." Malcolm saw the doctors exchange glances. He knew what they were thinking. This was going to be another mandatory training they had to sit through, another box to check, another waste of time when they could be seeing patients. "I know you don't want to be here," Malcolm said, cutting through the polite silence. "I know you've got patients to see and notes to write, and you're thinking this is just another administrative requirement that has nothing to do with actual medicine. So let me tell you a story, and then you can decide if what I have to say is worth your time." He told them about Noah, about the fever and the seizure and the waiting room, about Caroline Whitmore looking at his coveralls and deciding he could wait, about standing there with his dying son and knowing exactly what was wrong but being invisible because of how he looked. "I'm a black man who owns an auto repair shop," Malcolm said. "I have grease under my fingernails most days. I drive an old truck. I live in a neighborhood that most of you probably wouldn't visit after dark. And when I walked into this hospital with a critically ill child, I was judged before I said a word. Not because of anything I did, but because of assumptions about who deserves urgent care and who doesn't." He saw some of the doctors shifting uncomfortably. Good. They should be uncomfortable. Now, I'm also a doctor. I trained at Emory, did my residency at Grady, worked as a trauma surgeon for 5 years. I knew exactly what my son needed, and I knew how to communicate it clearly. But none of that mattered because the person at triage had already decided I was just another poor black father overreacting about a fever. Malcolm paused. "My son almost died because of that assumption. He seized on your waiting room floor because someone thought I didn't look important enough to listen to." The room was completely silent now. Malcolm could see the impact of his words landing, could see some of the doctors beginning to understand that this wasn't just another training exercise. "Here's what I learned that night," Malcolm continued. "Bias isn't always loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a hood or burn a cross. Sometimes it's just a tired nurse who assumes the well-dressed white woman's chest pain is more serious than the poorly dressed black man's. Sometimes it's a doctor who dismisses a Latina woman's pain as drug-seeking because she doesn't express it the way he expects. Sometimes it's a triage system that moves people through based on insurance status instead of medical need. He pulled up the data Caroline had compiled, the same spreadsheet that had shocked him months ago. The doctors leaned forward, studying the numbers, and Malcolm watched their faces change as they realized the scope of the problem. 72% of dangerous delays in our ER involved patients of color. 4 preventable deaths in 1 year, all minorities, all poor or uninsured. That's not random. That's systemic. That's a failure of medicine to live up to its own principles. A young resident raised her hand hesitantly. Dr. Reed, I understand what you're saying, but we're trained to triage based on medical need, not demographics. We don't intentionally treat people differently. I know you don't. That's what makes implicit bias so insidious. You think you're being objective, following protocols, making clinical decisions. But study after study shows that doctors consistently underestimate pain in Black patients, overestimate medication adherence in white patients, and make different treatment recommendations based on perceived socioeconomic status. You do it without thinking, without intending to, because you've been trained in a system that's built on those biases. Malcolm spent the next hour walking them through case after case, showing them the subtle ways bias crept into clinical decision-making. The Black patient whose heart attack symptoms were attributed to anxiety. The Latino child whose broken arm was questioned as possible abuse, while a similar injury in a white child wasn't. The homeless man whose altered mental state was dismissed as intoxication when it was actually a stroke. So what do we do? Another resident asked. How do we fix it? You start by acknowledging it exists. You can't fix a problem you won't admit you have. Malcolm pulled up a new slide. Then you implement systems that counteract bias. Standardized triage protocols that focus on symptoms, not presentation. Pain assessments that don't rely on subjective judgment. Regular audits of treatment disparities. And most importantly, you learn to check yourself constantly. When you find yourself making assumptions about a patient based on how they look or talk or smell, you stop and ask yourself, would I make the same assumptions about someone who looked different? He could see resistance in some faces, acceptance in others. Change was never universal or immediate. But he could also see people thinking, questioning, beginning to understand that good intentions weren't enough. Over the next 2 weeks, Malcolm ran 5 more training sessions. Each one started with his story and moved into data, case studies, and practical strategies for recognizing and interrupting bias. Some doctors embraced it immediately. Others pushed back, defensive and uncomfortable. Malcolm expected both reactions and handled them with the patient firmness of someone who'd lived both sides of the equation. Caroline sat in on every session, taking notes, asking pointed questions that pushed the doctors to think deeper. After the final training before the holiday break, she pulled Malcolm aside. You're a natural teacher. Have you thought about doing more of this, speaking at other hospitals, maybe publishing some of this work? Malcolm hadn't thought that far ahead. He was still getting used to the idea of being a doctor again, let alone becoming some kind of advocate or educator on a larger scale. One thing at a time, he said. Let me actually start working in the ER before I plan my TED Talk. Caroline laughed. Fair enough. But Malcolm, what you're doing here matters. These doctors are listening to you in a way they wouldn't listen to me or the hospital administration. You have credibility because you've lived it, and authority because you're one of them. That's powerful. Christmas came and went quietly. Malcolm and Noah decorated their small apartment, made cookies they burned slightly, watched holiday movies and pretended the ghost of Alicia wasn't sitting with them, smiling at their attempts to create traditions without her. Malcolm gave Noah a doctor's kit with real instruments, and Noah gave Malcolm a drawing he'd made of his dad in scrubs with a stethoscope and a cape, like a superhero. Because you save people, Noah explained. That's what superheroes do. Malcolm hung the drawing on the refrigerator and felt the weight of his son's expectations settle on his shoulders. Not a burden, exactly. More like a responsibility he was finally ready to carry again. January 1st dawned cold and clear. Malcolm drove to Mercy General in the pre-dawn darkness, his new white coat in a bag on the passenger seat, his stomach tight with nerves and anticipation. The ER was already busy when he arrived. Emergencies didn't take holidays, and doctor, Chen met him at the entrance with a coffee and a smile. "Welcome back, Dr. Reed. Ready for your first real shift?" "Ready as I'll ever be." Chen handed him the coffee and gestured toward the board. "We've got a full house. 2 cardiac cases, 1 possible stroke, 3 traumas from a car accident on the interstate, and the usual collection of chest pain and abdominal pain. I'm putting you on the trauma team. That's where you're strongest, and we need strong today." Malcolm pulled on his white coat, feeling the weight of it like armor and vulnerability all at once. The last time he'd worn one of these, he'd been a different person. Younger, more confident, certain that medicine could fix anything if you just knew enough and tried hard enough. Now he knew better. Knew that medicine was as much art as science, that outcomes were never guaranteed, that the best you could do was show up fully and fight like hell for every patient. He was ready for that fight now. Had been ready since the moment he'd held Noah's burning body in his arms and remembered who he used to be. The first trauma was a teenage girl from the car accident, conscious but with obvious internal injuries. Malcolm ran the code with Dr. Chen supervising, calling out orders, coordinating the team, making the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. When they got her stabilized and up to surgery, he felt the familiar rush of having done good work under pressure. The second trauma was harder. An elderly man who'd fallen at home and hit his head. He was conscious but confused, his speech slurred, one pupil blown. Malcolm knew that presentation, knew what it meant. Subdural hematoma, possible brain herniation. Time was everything. "We need neurosurgery now," Malcolm said. "This can't wait." But the neurosurgeon on call was in another surgery, wouldn't be available for at least an hour. Malcolm made the call to transfer the patient to another hospital with immediate neurosurgical availability, overriding the administrator who worried about the optics of transferring a patient out. "The optics of him dying here are worse," Malcolm said flatly. "Get him transferred." The man made it to the other hospital in time. Malcolm found out later that day that the surgery had gone well, that he'd probably make a full recovery. One life saved because someone had been willing to make the hard call. Not every case went that well. Malcolm lost his first patient 3 weeks into the job, a woman in her 40s who came in with chest pain that turned out to be a massive MY. They'd done everything right, followed every protocol, pushed every medication, and shocked her heart 4 times. But biology and bad luck had won anyway, and Malcolm had to tell her husband that she was gone. He dreaded that moment, feared that having to pronounce someone dead would break him the way Alicia's death had broken him. But Dr. Hammond's words came back to him. "You control what you can control and let go of the rest." Malcolm had done everything possible for this patient. Her death wasn't a failure of his skill or judgment. It was just the hard reality that sometimes people died despite the best efforts of medicine. It hurt. It would always hurt. But it didn't destroy him. He felt the grief, acknowledged it, and then went back to work because there were other patients who needed him. That night, he went home to Noah and held his son tighter than usual. Noah, intuitive as always, asked if someone had died. "Yeah, buddy, someone died today." "Are you sad?" "I am, but I also know I did everything I could for her. Sometimes that has to be enough." Noah thought about this. "Mrs. Patterson says when people die, the people who love them need extra hugs. Do you need extra hugs?" Malcolm pulled his son onto his lap. "I definitely need extra hugs." The weeks turned into months. Malcolm found his rhythm in the ER, the controlled chaos becoming familiar again, the faces of regular staff becoming colleagues and friends. He ran his training sessions with the residents, pushing them to examine their assumptions and biases. He worked his shifts with Tommy at the shop on his days off, getting his hands dirty and remembering that he could be more than one thing at once. And slowly, Malcolm noticed changes in the ER. Small things at first. A nurse who took extra time with a homeless patient, asking about his symptoms instead of assuming he was drunk. A resident who flagged a case for Malcolm's review because she'd caught herself making assumptions based on the patient's appearance. Triage times that were equalizing across demographic groups. The big change came in April when Caroline presented new data to the board. 6 months of tracking showed dramatic improvements. Dangerous triage delays down by 63%. Treatment disparities reduced across all demographic categories. Patient satisfaction scores up significantly among minority and low-income patients. These changes didn't happen by accident, Caroline told the board. They happened because we acknowledged we had a problem, implemented specific interventions, and held ourselves accountable. And they happened because Dr. Reed refused to let us pretend that good intentions were enough. She looked at Malcolm, who was sitting in the back of the room this time as a doctor rather than a patient advocate. 6 months ago, Dr. Reed stood in this room and told us about watching his son seize on our waiting room floor. He challenged us to do better. And now, because of the work he's done training our staff and restructuring our protocols, we're not just doing better, we're becoming the hospital we always claimed to be. One that treats every patient with dignity and urgency regardless of what they look like or where they come from. The board members nodded, some enthusiastically, some with the reserved approval of people who didn't like being told they'd been wrong but couldn't argue with results. After the meeting, Dr. Chen found Malcolm in the ER. "You've made a real difference here. You know that, right?" Malcolm thought about all the patients he'd seen in the past 6 months, about the teenagers and elderly folks and scared parents with sick kids. He thought about the ones he'd saved and the ones he'd lost and the ones who'd recovered because someone had finally listened to them. "I'm just doing the work," he said. "That's all any of us can do. But you're doing it better than most." In May, Malcolm got a call from a hospital in Memphis asking if he'd be willing to consult on their own bias training program. Then another from Birmingham. Then one from a medical school in Florida that wanted him to speak to their incoming residents. "You're becoming famous," Caroline teased when he mentioned the invitations. Dr. Malcolm Reed, the mechanic who became a crusader for equitable health care. "I'm not a crusader. I'm just a doctor who knows what it's like to be invisible." "That's exactly what makes you a crusader. You won't let anyone else be invisible either." Malcolm started accepting some of the speaking invitations, traveling on his days off to talk to other hospitals and medical schools. He told his story again and again. Noah's seizure, the waiting room, the assumptions that nearly cost his son's life. And every time he told it, he saw the same thing in his audience: discomfort, then recognition, then a slow dawning awareness that they could do better. Noah came with him sometimes when the speaking engagements were local. The boy would sit in the audience and listen to his father talk about the night he'd almost died. And afterward, people would come up to Noah and tell him how brave he'd been, how lucky he was to have a father who fought for him. "I know," Noah would say, with the simple certainty of childhood. "My dad's a superhero." Summer brought another milestone, the 1-year anniversary of Noah's meningitis. Malcolm took the day off, and they went to the park where Alicia used to take Noah when he was a baby. They spread a blanket under a tree and ate sandwiches and talked about everything and nothing. "Do you think about Mom a lot?" Noah asked suddenly. Malcolm set down his sandwich and looked at his son. "Every day." "Do you?" "Sometimes. I don't really remember her, but I remember the idea of her. Like, I know she would have made good cookies and read me stories and been proud of me." Noah plucked at the grass. "Mrs. Patterson says she'd be proud of you too, for being a doctor again." "I think she would. I think she'd be proud of both of us." "Because we're brave?" "Because we keep going even when things are hard. Because we help people. Because we love each other and take care of each other." Malcolm pulled Noah close. "That's what Mom would have wanted. For us to live full lives and help others, and not let losing her mean we lost ourselves too." "Did you lose yourself before?" The question was more perceptive than a 7-year-old should be, but Noah had always been wise beyond his years. "Yeah, buddy, I did, for a while. But then you got sick, and I remembered who I used to be. And I realized I could be that person again, just different. Better, maybe. Because now I understand what it's like to need help and not get it. And I can make sure that doesn't happen to other people." Noah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad I got sick." "Noah, not because being sick was good, but because it made you be a doctor again. You're happier now, I can tell." Malcolm felt tears prick his eyes. His son was right, he was happier. Not in the uncomplicated way he'd been happy before Alicia died, but in a deeper, more complex way that came from having faced pain and survived it, from having lost himself and found his way back, from having run away and finally stopped running. "You're a smart kid, you know that?" "I get it from you," Noah said,